Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the third in a series of 5 webinars. These are sponsored by the Florida Department of Transportation. This is the Workforce Development Series for public transportation providers and professionals. I'm Sara Hendricks with the Center for Urban Transportation Research at University of South Florida in Tampa, and I will be the moderator for today. This webinar is being recorded. And today the topic is first mile and last mile safety. So when we speak of first mile and last mile safety, we're generally talking about legs of a trip or a journey. And these legs can be taken by walking, bicycling, e-bicycling, or using some other micromobility device like a scooter. And these legs of a trip are usually short, such as between about 1/4 of a mile to 3 miles in length, and can either comprise the entire journey or meant to link with public transit at the beginning of the journey or at the end of the journey. And this is important because roughly 50% of all trips are 3 miles or less, meaning they have the potential to be taken by walking or bicycling. And many people do not walk or bicycle because they feel unsafe. So addressing safety of short trips as well as the first mile and last mile links to a transit stop can encourage more people to walk or bicycle and use public transit. So before we kind of dive into our topic today, I'd like to say just a few words about the Workforce Development Series. The first webinar was on the topic of applying artificial intelligence in transportation. That was in May. The second webinar that took place in June was on the topic of mobility on demand. And you can access these recorded webinars at the commuterservices.com website and click on courses. And you can access the recordings, the slide decks, and also register for the next webinars. So on August 6th, we will talk about transit ridership. And by the way, these topics were identified by a survey of Florida transportation professionals. Perhaps you participated in it yourself. And this survey was about topics that transportation professionals in Florida are most interested in learning more about. The transit ridership webinar presenters will represent 2 Florida transit agencies whose ridership was resilient through the COVID-19 pandemic. These are Indian River County Go Line, featuring Karen Diggle and Chris Stevenson. And we're also going to feature Bayway Transit in Panama City, Florida, that serves Bay County. And their transit director is Lamar Hobbs, who is going to join us. So all these workforce development courses are free for transportation professionals. The last one I almost forgot to mention is September 3rd on the topic of micromobility. Anybody who cannot attend the live webinar can register afterward. They can watch the recording and also earn a certificate of completion. So today's presenters, I'm happy to introduce Kyle Simpson. He is a senior principal planner for Forward Pinellas. Kyle holds a master's in regional planning from the University at Albany and a bachelor's in interdisciplinary studies from the University of Central Florida. Kyle is responsible for development and implementation of the Forward Pinellas Active Transportation Plan, managing the agency's non-motorized count program, and assisting in the planning and implementation of multimodal transportation projects in Pinellas County and throughout the Tampa Bay region. And then we have Jacob Labutka. He is the planning manager at Pinellas Suncoast Transit Authority. Jacob leads a variety of projects, such as the agency's Connected Community Bus Network System Redesign and PSTA's discretionary grant applications. Jacob also oversees several innovative transit programs, such as the integration of PSTA's first and last mile program into the transit app, and PSTA's upcoming autonomous bus yard demonstration. Jacob is a graduate of Rutgers University, where he earned a master's in city and regional planning. And a little bit about me: I am the Deputy Program Director for the Transportation Options Program at Qatar. I have over 20 years of experience doing research in transportation planning at Qatar. Prior to my work at Qatar, I worked in private consulting. So we're going to start off by just reviewing the course objectives. So safe access to transit begins and ends with the journey to and from stops and stations. So in this session, participants will examine the most common safety barriers affecting pedestrians, bicyclists, and micromobility users, and learn how to apply safe system principles to reduce risk. Also, we're going to discover strategies to improve safety and accessibility in short connections to transit. But first, I'm going to talk about the benefits of walking and bicycling and introduce the safe system approach. And then Kyle Simpson and Jacob Labutka will acquaint us with the active transportation and access to transit programs that they have planned and implemented in Pinellas County. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat box at any time, and our speakers can answer them as we go. And then we will wrap it up with some key takeaways from our conversation. Okay, so first of all, with regard to bicycling activity, if we look at bicycle mode share for commuting nationwide, it's generally less than about 1%. However, many cities have higher bicycle mode shares, such as those listed in the table to the left. And if we discuss in terms of absolute numbers of bicyclists, we're talking about numbers in the thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, as shown in the graph on the right. There was a study in 2025 that analyzed the national household travel survey data using a combination of quantitative surveys, spatial data analysis, and case studies of cities with well-developed cycling infrastructure. The researchers found that effective cycling infrastructure significantly boosts cycling accessibility, and it enhances active commuting rates. So now, with more people riding e-bikes for transportation purposes, they can be used for completing an entire commute trip. E-bikes can easily go as far as the average commute distance. But now this is just about commuting. If we look at other trip purposes made by bike, we see that commuting is just about 13%, and the other 87% is for social and recreational trips, going to school and church, shopping, and other personal business. This is for a total of about 2.2 billion person trips made by bike in 2022, based on the NHTS data. And we know that better infrastructure supports these trips. There was a 2025 study in New York City that showed an increase in the use of bike sharing ridership in the vicinity of newly installed protected bike lanes. And there's a trade association known as People for Bikes. They ranked more than 3,000 U.S. cities according to their bike networks that enable bicyclists to take everyday trips like going to work, school, shopping, healthcare, and getting to the transit hub. And this year, 2026, People for Bikes rated more than 550 U.S. communities that have now satisfied the threshold for providing everyday bikeability. This is double what they ranked in 2025. So this demonstrates the work that's being done by communities nationwide to improve conditions for bicycling. And this makes good investment sense, considering that roughly 50% of all trips are under 3 miles. And then regarding pedestrian activity, I think perhaps walking is the most important mode, but also the most taken for granted mode of travel. Based on NHTS travel data, about 10% of all trips in the U.S. were made by walking as the main mode of transportation from origin to destination. However, that does not count for all those connecting trips. So walking is crucial for accessing or connecting to almost all other modes, including bus stops and rail stations. Motorists have to walk to parking lots or garages to get to their cars. Cyclists have to walk to get to their bike parking facilities. You might be wondering about these pictures, these photos on the screen. So these photos are from the publication Pop-Up City in the Netherlands. And some interesting work was recently done by researcher Gabrielle Dunoff of the University of Manitoba. She developed a typology for urban design interventions that encourage walking based on the human desire to play. And this includes adults. So these photos show examples such as, like in the top right, the chance social encounters that people have while they're walking. So that's a picture of some debate going on in the street, or finding and using alternative routes like the sculpture in the bottom right, or accelerating your descent down the staircase to the subway by using the sliding board. So, we may walk more often if it's fun to do. So I wanted to leave you with that. And then ask you what you think are the benefits of walking and bicycling. So it's your turn to kind of share what you think are some benefits, and use the chat. Tell us, the kinds of benefits that perhaps in your experience of walking and bicycling you enjoy. You're also welcome to unmute and just tell us what you think. And while you're thinking and putting, okay, being out in nature. Thank you, Jamie. These pictures on the screen are also some interesting examples. Perhaps you've heard of the use of elephant paths, which is figuring out where to put the sidewalks based on the tracks made by pedestrians in the grass. Michigan State University used that. And I'm seeing some more in the chat. Seeing public art, yes. Long walks on trails, less stress and exercise. Walking and biking are beneficial to overall health. Burning calories, yes. Discovering new paths and views, improved health, congestion decrease. Those are all great examples. Improved health, yes. The picture on the right, I enjoy. It's from Sweden. So here in the United States, we celebrate Halloween on October 31st. In Sweden, they don't celebrate Halloween on October 31st. That is Good Neighbor Day in Sweden. And so they had a campaign that was kicked off on their Good Neighbor Day called Say Hello. And so the idea was to promote people being social. When you pass somebody by on the sidewalk, say hello. And it was a kind of a campaign to deal with the fact that people are feeling socially isolated and lonely, particularly in the dark months of fall and winter. So I thought that was an interesting take on when you're a pedestrian, you have the opportunity to meet people. So there's a social element to walking as well. Okay, so just a few really quick slides on the safe system approach. So there are some premises that underlie it. One death on the transportation system is too many. 0 fatalities is possible. Some communities have achieved this. And then there's the 6 principles. Deaths and life-changing injuries are unacceptable. Humans make mistakes. We cannot achieve perfect behavior, so the system must anticipate mistakes and protect against the worst outcomes. The human body is vulnerable, particularly to the forces of kinetic energy transferred in a crash. So we have to design for safety before a crash ever occurs. And then achieving safety requires shared responsibility among us and collaboration across the many stakeholders and disciplines. And then system redundancy protects against any weakness in the system. And so that redundancy is oftentimes illustrated in the Swiss cheese model. The safe system is the result of doing the 6 principles, and it also includes planning, designing, constructing, operating, and using the system with safety in mind. And so when one of these layers fails, the other layers kick in to prevent a fatality or a serious injury. So when our communities are planning effectively and efficiently, people can access what they need more easily. And this means trips that are reduced in distance so that more trips can be made by walking, rolling, biking, and public transit. And these These modes can reduce the traveler's exposure to risk of crashes because they're making shorter trips using lower speed modes. And then finally, the safety action plan. This is part of the safe system approach with 4 basic characteristics, which are systemic, data-driven, a focus on reducing fatalities and serious injuries. They're based on the community's priorities, values, and needs, and then the 7 key components listed on the right. I want to call your attention to the link at the bottom. Has some really good resources, including NCHRP report number 948 that assesses intersections specifically for bicycle and pedestrian considerations. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Kyle.
Thank you. Hi, so I'm Kyle Simpson, and I'm with for Pinellas. If you go to the next slide.
Sure. No, I can. Here we go.
So for Pinellas is the Metropolitan Planning Organization for Pinellas County. There are over 410 metropolitan planning organizations around the United States. Florida has 27 of them. They were formed in the 1960s by Congress through the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1962. And the original purpose was to create a shared vision around where the interstate highway system should go and how it should interact with urban areas. This was a huge investment in mobility throughout the country, and one of the single largest public works investments that the United States has ever made in one specific program. And so there was a lot of, competing interests of where it should go, how it should interact with the downtown versus go through, go around, things like that, as well as how it should connect, for instance, in our area, St. Petersburg to Tampa. We want to make sure that there was coordination between the 2 counties on these large investments to make sure that they actually connected with each other and were complementary. So if you go to the next slide. So the major functions that we have is creating a long-range transportation plan that currently goes out to 2050. And in that, we look at existing and expected population and employment statistics so that we can plan for the amount of people and jobs that we anticipate having 25 years from now, like physical infrastructure, so roads, sidewalks, bike lanes, transit facilities. They take a long time from an idea to reality on the ground. And so having a clear vision of where we want to be helps us achieve that vision. How we achieve that is through our priority project lists. So this is kind of a 5 to 10 year look at this is where we want to be 25 years from now. These are the projects that we're going to fund either for engineering and design or construction over the next 5 years to achieve that vision. So each MPO has one of these, and these are the lists that FDOT then uses when doing the 5-year work program of what they're going to build. So at Fort Pinellas, we have discretion on how we prioritize that list, and basically FDOT starts at the top of the list and works down until they run out of funding for that year. And then we do the process all over again next year. So at the top of our list, we include $1.5 million for capital funds for our transit agency, PSTA. And so this is something newer that the funding has just now worked its way into the work program. FDOT's work program is 5 years. When something's added, it's added to the 5th year. So even if we put something on number 1 on our list this year, it's very possible that funding won't show up until 2032. So there's not a lot of instant gratification, but it's you work and you get there eventually. And so that funding can be used for things like transit shelters, seats at transit stops, or like buses and things like that. So any physical capital. We also prioritize the Sunrunner Bus Rapid Transit Project, which is operational. It opened in the early 2020s, and that took 20 years to get across the finish line, and we'll both talk about that more as we go along. And then we also have a federal program called the Transportation Alternatives Program. And so most of the funding that MPOs prioritize come from the federal surface transportation bill. So currently it's the IIJA. It's currently up for reauthorization. And so I think it's Build 250 or something like that. It's draft form right now. But basically, when you hear Congress is talking about transportation funding, those dollars are what we prioritize at the local level. And so this program historically set aside 2% of the total funding for active transportation, so walking and biking, and so that can include access to transit routes and stops. If you go ahead to the next slide. So I just wanted to touch a little bit on, so this is the Sunrunner Bus Rapid Transit Project. It goes from downtown St. Petersburg out to St. Pete Beach. In the city of St. Petersburg, First Avenue North, which is on the top of the screen, and then First Avenue South, which is on the bottom, are one-way pairs. And so we added a dedicated bus lane to the left side of each of those roadways. The reason for that is we wanted to provide the best possible pedestrian connection to Central Avenue, which serves as the main street of St. Petersburg. And then in the middle, the nice round wheel or steering wheel looking building is Grand Central Terminal Station. So it's a major PSTA transit center. So if you go to the next slide. This is what the station stops look like. So First Avenues used to be 3-lane one-way pairs, and so now there's a dedicated bus and turn lane on the left side of the street with island platforms, and then part of the corridor has a bike lane, and part of it, the bike lane was shifted to Central Avenue. But as part of this, to make the to increase safety for everyone, you'll see there's a little island at the near side of the intersection before far side where the actual transit stop is. And then as well as on the right side, we put in planted median islands as kind of like a curb extension of sorts to try to narrow up the street and make it feel like a place that people should expect activity and expect people to be walking and biking and behave accordingly. You go to the next slide. So this is First Avenue South. If you're really keen, you'll notice that the other picture had a traffic signal, but on this side, on First Avenue South, there was not. So we put in flashing beacons to provide that safe and comfortable pedestrian access to not only the Sunrunner stop, but the Grand Central Station and the major transfer point that's there. And then right now under construction on the far right of that picture is a huge multifamily housing project or complex that is in conjunction with land for the St. Petersburg YMCA. So we're going to have a bunch of even more people living near all this transit access that's provided. So if you go ahead to the next. So whenever we're looking at kind of access to transit facilities and just active transportation in general, it's a really different animal than kind of designing a highway. There's the details matter a lot more, and sometimes those details are hard to work with. So street lighting is a big one, and then sidewalk obstructions and landscaping. So the pictures on the right side are the same street, like 4 blocks apart from each other. So one, you'll see drainage. That's always a challenge for us, especially in developed areas of the county where it's kind of legacy systems. We're not starting from scratch with anything. It's always retrofitting. And so making sure we don't have residual ponding and drainage issues right where we expect someone to walk. Kind of on the side of sidewalk obstructions as well. Again, not necessarily a typical like engineering issue, but anytime there's maintenance of traffic, so cones, signs, pylons, they often get knocked over and then just lay on the sidewalk for months and months until someone kicks it out of the way or the company finally goes and picks it up. So it's kind of a little bit of, there's an engineering component to all this, but also the operations and maintenance is really important and can really make the experience like decent or treacherous. You know, it sucks to walk along a road that has ponding drainage where the right tire track of the vehicle is, and then the sidewalk's right on the back of curb. And so someone walking there would get splashed by someone driving by. Like that's just a bad experience and something we should look to avoid. Shade, it's hot in Florida. Um, Again, the difference between, even though the bottom picture, it's still a back of curb sidewalk and next to a parking lot, but just the difference that trees provide, not only in the comfort, but also just feeling it's a nicer place to be, like if you're walking versus like just trying to get through as fast as you can. And I think this all gets to the point of pedestrian safety is often perception as well. Like something can be by the book, safe, quote unquote, by all the engineering manuals, but it doesn't feel comfortable and thus it's not perceived as being safe. So I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind while we're designing these facilities and looking at maintenance of things of, it might be safe, there might be a sidewalk, but what's the context of that sidewalk? And is it a place that people would actually be comfortable, using or accessing? If you go to the next slide. So we're gonna jump a little bit from kind of an urban setting to something that's we see this a lot around Florida. It's a big intersection. I actually went through here earlier going to our district office, our Pinellas FDOT office. So Ulmerton Road's a state road, and then 49th Street's a major county road. If you have really good eyes, you'll see the crosswalk, that's the north-south crosswalk on the east side of the street. From curb ramp to curb ramp is over 160 feet long. So if you go to the next slide, that's what it looks like. You'll see that there's a bus way in the distance. So there's good transit service on Ulmerton Road, as is the case with a lot of our huge streets like this in Florida are often the ones that have the best transit service because that's where the jobs and the multifamily housing are. So it's kind of the most uncomfortable place to walk is often the place where everyone needs to access either housing or employment or services on. So how can we make that work better together? So if you go to the next slide. So just to provide a little more context, if you're not from this area, there's around 53,000 vehicles a day on Ulmerton, 70,000 on 49th Street, so the north-south road. So that's a lot of traffic, right? So we have to take that into account. If we're calculating signal timing, you have to provide a minimum of 7 seconds with the Walkman illuminated. And then we calculate the pedestrian clearance phase, so that's the flashing don't walk. It's 3.5 feet per second. So at this intersection, kind of the minimum time you could allocate to a pedestrian signal is 53 seconds. And so that's a long time. This is like a major intersection, so your cycle might be that long anyway. But oftentimes when you're crossing Ulmerton Road and it's a minor side street, your pedestrian signal timing is going to drive that's way longer than you would normally allocate to the side street itself. And so if there's ways that we can reduce the crossing distance that can help us with traffic operations because we don't have to provide such a long pedestrian signal time. So some of the conflicts that we often hear of and see at these types of intersections are, so the right turn, someone going westbound on Ulmerton Road, making a right to go northbound on 49th Street, so right on red. Oftentimes we might have a flashing yellow arrow assembly, so someone can make a left turn anytime the through traffic has a green light. And it's a lot to ask of a driver to be looking at 3 lanes of traffic coming at them at 50 miles an hour, and then also look for someone that might be trying to cross in the crosswalk. That's just a lot to ask, and we see that often mistakes are made in those judgment calls. And then we also have right turn lanes on 49th Street. And so if you have someone that's trying to make a right turn, they might not stop for someone crossing in that crosswalk. So with that, are there any kind of potential solutions that you all could put in the chat on how we would address some of those potential conflicts with the tools that you might have seen kind of around in your own community?
Well, that intersection really does have a lot of conflicts.
Yes,
Now that you pointed them out, Kyle.
there's a lot going on. That would be
Yeah.
a super roundabout. So I like
Oh,
that.
yeah.
Um,
And it
but
looks like,
yes,
yeah, somebody, yeah. That was both Toby and Betty Ann suggest that, and Allison suggests a protected left turn or a what is it? FYA, omit by
flashing yellow arrow.
flashing yellow arrow, omit by pedestrian.
Yep. So that's a really good point, Allison. And something I've been really focused on here is so basically we see the flashing yellow arrow assembly is where it's a red, yellow, green, and then the bottom one's a flashing yellow arrow. So it's instead of it was called a doghouse signal where it was the left turn signals and then the ball signals and then a red on top. We've gone to the flashing yellow arrow and it's provides safety benefits, but it also gives you ability to not allow a permissive left turn if someone presses, someone's trying to cross the street. So that's a really easy safety thing to implement. So if you go to the next slide.
Okay, and we did have one other suggestion from Deborah, a leading pedestrian interval, protected turns, splitter islands, and no right turn on red signs.
Yep, those are all great suggestions. Um, so I went through and you all already hit on some of these. You can do static or a blank out no turn on red. So sometimes we see static signs might have, so static means it's just a sign that's out there all the time. It might be less effective than if we have a sign that turns on and says no turn on red when someone has pressed the pedestrian button. And then again, we could not allow a left turn when there's a pedestrian. And then there's also, over the past couple of years, FDOT's been really good about putting the opportunities to improve intersections within the Florida Design Manual. And so I pulled out some of the best resources that I'm aware of that touch on all this. And so we will highlight some of these as we go forward. So if we go to the next slide. Another thing, we often have mid-block transit stops. So this is just down the road from the intersection that we were talking about. It's around 1,400 feet down the road. So if you go to the next slide, if we're calculating at that 3.5 feet per second, if someone gets off the bus on the south side of the street to go to a business on the north side, we would say it's safest to cross at a crosswalk, right? But to do that, it's a 14-minute delay. And so that's not actually a reasonable ask of someone to do. Like, no sane person is going to do that. And so designing our environment in a way that makes doing the right thing the thing that people do intuitively is really important. If you go to the next slide, how you do that is, I think we went one more, sorry.
Here?
Yep. So pedestrian hybrid beacons are something that our district has been installing a lot of on these types of roadways lately. And when we do that, we coordinate really closely with PSTA and the local community. And so this basically mid-block provides that safe crossing to get someone across the road without having to play Frogger, basically. And the warrants for these are a lot lower than a traditional traffic signal. And we're getting to the point where they can be installed sometimes proactively instead of waiting for problems to happen. We can anticipate that this is a place people want to cross, and it's a crossing location that we should provide before it pops up as a problem in our crash data. So if we go to the next slide. So again, we have this, and then one more. So this is close to home for friends at USF. So this is Fowler Avenue, which is a state road in Bruce B. Downs. And so they recently implemented a lot of those countermeasures that I referenced in the Florida Design Manual. So the pink looking things are truck aprons. So they basically put they're mountable, so to speak. So if there's a tractor trailer, that trailer can roll over the pink area, so they can still make the turn. But for the majority of the traffic, which is passenger vehicles, it tightens up that radius so that people have a better sight line of someone in a crosswalk, and they're also just going slower. Because we see basically to get someone driving to stop for someone in a crosswalk, it's a lot easier for them to intuitively do that if they're going 20 miles an hour or less. Once you get above that speed, it's really hard to encourage someone to stop like they're supposed to. So again, it's designing the environment to facilitate the behavior that we want to see. They also highlighted the bike facility that exists out there and provided refuge islands. On the Ulmerton Road example, they're just paint, whereas out here, they're actually concrete. We often call them pork chop islands. So you can cross the right lane and then get out and then cross the through traffic and then complete your trip. And that also helps too if someone, might be slower than 3.5 feet per second. We don't want to strand them in the middle of the intersection. So this just gives that extra space if they're not able to get across in the time allotted. If you go to the next slide. So often here, we're Florida, we're special, right? Like we have problems because we're special and nowhere else in the world has big roads. I recently had the opportunity to go to Spain in Barcelona, and they had big roads. So if you go to the next slide, it's a lot of traffic. It was like 6 to 8 lanes each direction. A little different context, but still, like, there's cars and they're going fast. And so what are some of the differences that they have implemented and have seen better safety outcomes? If you go to the next slide. So just to highlight the right of way, so from the southernmost frontage road to the northernmost frontage road, we're at like 230 feet of right of way, which is a ton of space. And so what they do is they just allocate it a little differently. So you'll have like the through traffic in the middle, and then transit access and local business access on the sides. And that's where the main pedestrian and cycling accommodations are. And so it's just an interesting way to look at. They provide for the kind of regional traffic, but then also provide for the local traffic. And that's where they put the main sidewalks on the frontage road, which has a lower speed, which is just a more comfortable environment and a more safe environment. So if you go to the next slide, and out of that like 230 feet of right of way, the actual main drag is like 65 feet. And so again, if you're looking at that signal crossing time, that's a lot shorter crossing distance and time that you have to allocate to the pedestrian signal than if you were trying to cross everything at one time. If you go to the next. We have an example of that in Florida, in St. Petersburg. So this is alternate 19, Tyrone Boulevard, known locally. And it's the same concept, different land use context, yes. But again, the regional traffic is in the middle. And then we have the local access and the sidewalks on the frontage roads. And so these are just a tool in the toolbox that can provide different alternatives to achieve both kind of mobility as well as access. You go to the next slide. And we also have transit accommodations. And so again, it might be nicer if the bench was on the curb side, but someone walks on the frontage road, which has a speed limit of 25 instead of 45 on the main line. And it's just another example of a way to think about how can we accommodate the regional traffic that we need to accommodate while providing, options and a pleasant experience for all users out there. One more. So just want to close with a lot of the access to transit and designing for people walking and biking is meeting people where they are versus saying the problem is you didn't cross at this intersection. Oftentimes the way we design for traffic just doesn't apply directly to walking and biking. And so we just need to make sure that we're considering the environment that they're in. Same for when we're looking through crash data. Oftentimes, a crash on a state highway like Ulmerton Road will just say the problem was the pedestrian wasn't in a crosswalk, and that's the cause of the crash. If we see that, we should like look at where it happened and then look at the context of, where was the nearest crossing? Like, was this a rational choice that they made? Did they get off of a bus and then we're crossing when they got off the bus? Things like that. So just making sure we take in the whole context of why things happen, or even more importantly, trying to look at when we're doing a project, what could happen, and designing the environment to make sure that it doesn't come up in a crash report in the future. Looking at making our signalized intersections more safe and comfortable for people walking. If we want to encourage people to cross at a signalized intersection with a crosswalk, we should make that experience better, more safe and comfortable for everyone. It's not really fair for us to expect someone making a left turn unprotected to also look for someone walking or biking in a crosswalk on a 3 or 4 lane road. So just making sure that we're giving everyone the fair opportunity to succeed. And then also that ongoing operations and maintenance is really important. Like landscaping grows really quickly here. I know it's outside of the purview of, say, our transit operators or sometimes FDOT, but that's where that ongoing partnership really comes in, where that we're all working together to make sure that all of these systems work cohesively, and when issues come up, we know who to contact. We have an ongoing relationship with them, and so we can help each other succeed in getting everyone moving around safely and comfortably, no matter how they want to move. And with that, I will pass it on to Jacob.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Kyle. That was really information packed. And I have a few questions, but I'm going to hold them till the end so that we can get to Kyle's presentation. So, or I'm sorry, Jacob. Jacob, take it away.
Okay, we're going backwards. No biggie. No. All right, well, thank you, Sarah and Kyle, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jacob Labutka, and I am the planning manager at the Pinellas Suncoast Transit Authority. Also apologize for my camera not working. The overlords at Lenovo don't seem to be cooperating with me today, but at least I can have audio brought to you all today. So we are the public transportation operator in Pinellas County. As shown by the map on the screen, this is our route network as it exists since October of 2025, when we implemented our largest network redesign in our 40-year history that we called our Connected Community Bus Network. Our bread and butter is fixed route buses, where we serve most areas of Pinellas County as shown on the map, but we do also provide at least currently 3 routes that go over into our neighbors in Tampa and Hillsborough County. So some, not all, but some of what I'm going to be talking to today was a part of the planning for this project. So this was a 2-year planning project where we actually had to survey our riders to understand their behavior and asked about their preferences for interacting with our bus stops. And in addition, there's elements of recommendations that were implemented through changes to our network design that very much relate to improvements in pedestrian and transit rider safety. And so with that, just wanted to set the scene here with just a little bit about us and our network. But if Sarah, if you go to the next slide and we can dive into the fun. Actually, can you go back one slide? Sorry, I forgot that I was inspired. You probably saw a little bit about it already, but I forgot I was inspired by Sarah and Kyle asking questions to the chat. So I'm going to do that real quick. And so my question is going to be very basic, but if my question to you, if you could put into the chat, would be for anybody who has recently taken transit, doesn't matter how long ago, if it was yesterday, a week ago, year ago, could even be 5 years ago. How did you get to the bus stop? Or how did you get to the train stop? Did you walk? Did you bike? Did somebody drop you off? Did you magically appear there? That one's obviously a little fantastical, but who am I to judge? So let's just see in the chat how you got to transit the last time you were there. Okay, good. I was about to be sad if nobody put anything, because I would be sad if nobody on here took transit, which I understand that's not an option for everybody. But all right, we're looking All right, this is all right. We're seeing a lot of walking. And if I were typing, I would be putting in walking. I was just in Toronto in Canada, and I did a lot of walking to bus and rail stops. All right, so it looks like there's a good bit of walking. But we also have biking, driving to the Brightline station. So, okay, we've got a good sample size here. So now, Sarah, you can actually go to the next slide. And so this is a chart where the beginning part of our system redesign process is every 5 years, we are legally or federally required to do a statistically valid onboard survey of all of our riders so we can understand their demographics, their travel behavior. This time around, I believe we had at least 30 questions that we asked to riders who we surveyed during the spring of 2023. And so one of the questions that's shown on the screen that we asked our riders, that very much relates to this conversation today, is how did you get to the bus stop on your trip? Since, we can't just wiggle our nose and disappear at the bus stop. And if we could pull a Bewitched, most of us on this call would likely be out of business. But that's a webinar for another day. So not really a surprise for anybody, I don't think, that if you look at the column on the left, this is showing what the answers were system-wide, regardless of mode. We are a bus agency, but we do also have a few trolley routes that are essentially buses with trolley-like packaging, and our bus rapid transit system, Sunrunner, that Kyle mentioned during her portion of the presentation. System-wide, as you can see on the chart, with over 6,000 responses with it to compile a statistically valid survey, 91% of our riders either walked or took a wheelchair to the bus stop. Again, not really a surprise, but just interesting to see that validated through the data. We do still have several percentage of points of riders, 4% system-wide, who are taking a personal bike or a scooter to a bus stop. So obviously, this emphasizes the importance of working closely with our friends at Ford Pinellas and with the various cities, so designing safe and comfortable, to the extent possible, pedestrian and bike infrastructure to get to and from transit. And then, of course, people get to the bus stop in other ways besides walking and biking, but it is certainly the minority of trips. And one little interesting observation I was actually noticing as I was preparing for this presentation, not very significant, but if you look at the Sunrunner column, you'll see that the walking mode share to get to the stops is a little bit lower and the biking is a little bit higher. And I would say that's very much reflective of the enhanced bike infrastructure along the Sunrunner corridor that Kyle referenced during his portion of the presentation. And I believe there are just a little bit more bike commuting or bicycle activity in St. Pete compared with our other cities in Pinellas County. Again, probably largely in part due to the enhanced infrastructure there when compared to other areas and the safer roadway conditions. Go to the next slide, please. Another question we asked in surveys in one of the various phases of our Connected Community Bus Network planning process is basically a debate between would you rather walk or would you rather wait at a bus stop? And so what I mean by that is in designing our new network, a concept we put forward to the community was, would you rather have a coverage-oriented service where we try to serve more places, but the consequence of that on a fixed budget is you're likely going to have reduced frequency of routes maybe coming every 60 minutes, versus in a ridership or a frequency-oriented network, you would want to have the bus coming every 15 minutes or less, to where you would be less likely to need to check a schedule because you know that within the next 15 minutes or less, a bus is going to be coming. But of course, the consequence of that is on a fixed budget, you're not going to have as many coverage routes and not going to have as many routes in general, since it takes more buses to operate that type of network. And so for some riders, they might have to walk a little further to the bus stop. And so this was interesting, the way this question was phrased in the respondents. So the two columns on the left are those who either strongly prefer or generally prefer a shorter walking distance. So they would prefer a bus stop that is closer to them. Of course, again, the consequence being the bus comes less often. Versus those who prefer shorter waits, where the bus is going to come in the next 15 minutes or less. But again, the consequence of that on a fixed budget is needing to walk longer. So this is just kind of an interesting way just to have this conversation with the community of what should be prioritized. And with any system, it tends to be a mix between these two extremes. And that's certainly what we ended up going with our network. But it was just interesting seeing that preference for the ridership-oriented services and people willing to walk a little further. And that was certainly reflected in our overall network design and recommendations, and which again really emphasizes the importance of working with our partners at Pinellas and the cities, since the only thing within our control are transit operations, whereas curb space is an entirely different animal controlled by other jurisdictions. But it's really important for us to be in coordination with those who can control pedestrian safety, curb space, and sidewalk space. And so I'm going to briefly touch on 3 different types of design that are in various levels of control that have to deal with first last mile safety for transit riders. And if you go to the next slide, please, I'm not going to spend as much time on kind of this first bucket of infrastructure design, because Kyle did a really good job going through a bunch of different examples. I literally just, before I left on my trip last week, I went to a few bus stop locations at different parts of our county to show some different examples of, great connection with other modes of transportation and the street network, and others where we did the best we could with the roadway conditions that we had. So starting on the top left is probably looks familiar with some of the slides that Kyle shared, which is a Sunrunner stop. This is a Sunrunner stop along our bus rapid transit line on 1st Avenue South and 8th Street in downtown St. Pete. And this is a really great example of a bus stop. We've got a totem with real-time information, a shelter to provide coverage from blaringly hot summer days, particularly now. And we have parallel and in-sync modes of transportation. So of course, this is a premium transit route. So we have the infrastructure for buses to be able to stop at a raised platform. We have the parallel bike trail, that's the Pinellas Trail, and parallel to that is the sidewalk where transit riders can, get to and from the bus stop, and we have crossings to get to and from the station. So really great example of connectivity. Top right, this is another premium station, our Spark route, that doesn't have a dedicated lane, but it's fewer stops, very frequent. But here, we unfortunately did not have a bus and turn lane like we do in the Sunrunner example, but we still have enhanced station design, amenities. Obviously, as Kyle pointed out in another example, we have a lot of roadways here. So we tried to design the Spark stations with pedestrian and first last mile comfort in mind, but with the context and knowledge that this is a wide roadway. And so the factor that is within our control here is putting the station as close to the crosswalk as possible so we can, to the extent possible, try to prevent people from having to play Frogger, which is an unfortunate reality across many corridors where there are long distances between connecting streets. On the bottom left, shown here is in the northern part of our service area on US 19. And so you can see this is doing the best we can with what we have. So there must have been some sidewalk construction, and we've got some little orange barricades here that's creating kind of a pseudo sidewalk using what I believe is the shoulder of US 19, right adjacent to what's technically a bike lane where maybe according to some manual, it's textbook safe, but to Kyle's point, does it really feel safe? But we're at least, able in the conditions to still serve folks here via transit through maintaining the bus stop access, even though there is construction. But again, it might be textbook safe, but some people could feel unsafe. But long term, there could be potential in a space like this, because you'll notice all of the right-of-way that's available immediately to the right of the bus stop area. And this is very much reminds me of an overall conversation we're having right now to install bus bays, areas where the buses could actually pull off from the corridor, be able to go off out of the way of traffic, and to be accompanied by enhanced passenger amenities with better connections to the pedestrian network. So doing the best what we have, but maybe there's potential in the future to improve the transit rider experience. And on the bottom right, this is a bus stop on State Road 580. This is a corridor that connects Pinellas and Hillsborough County in the northern part of our community. And so here, this is just a bus stop sign that's probably been there for decades, even prior to the ADA. Probably the only saving grace here that's not shown in the picture is that in the foreground of the picture, there is at least a crosswalk to get over to the other side of the intersection. And that's about realistically all that could be done, because here it's a tough call because it is a high volume route or high volume corridor with lots of traffic, high speeds, and there will likely be areas that aren't necessarily as close to a crosswalk like Lyft Stop. But we also know that people still need to get where they need to go. So we still do need to provide bus stops in some of those areas, even if it's not necessarily the most ideal. Again, why those continued conversations with FDOT for Pinellas and the cities is so important so we can improve safety. But in a context like this, being able to improve the passenger experience, even taking ridership aside for a moment, is limited. Here in this example, you'll notice vegetation that's likely mangroves or other things that would be very onerous to try to get right-of-way acquisition for. So realistically, there are just some areas like this where we'll do the best that we can. But again, as a transit authority with no land use power, to be honest, only so much we can do, but we still want to the extent possible, work with our friends over at Ford Pinellas to see where we can incorporate design strategies from an infrastructure perspective to improve the experience. Next slide, please. So something that is with a little more of our control is program design. And so I'll just very quickly mention our first last mile program, Direct Connect. And so this is a program that allows riders to get to or from transit on Uber, Lyft, taxi services, or wheelchair transportation assisted services. Though I will note that 90% of program users utilize transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft on this program. And so I think this is primarily intended as a program for riders who are a bit of a walk away from a bus stop, but it could also be utilized in some of those areas like I just showed on the map where we may not have much ability to meaningfully improve safety in a significant way, but we could at least have a program that helps riders in some of those areas get to a much better bus stop location in areas where maybe we have little or no control over the pedestrian environment. So this is just one of the tools in our toolbox from our rider from a programmatic perspective. Next slide, please. And for my last slide. So talking about network design, what can we do in terms of how we design the transit network to improve connectivity and transit rider safety? So this is our transit system as it looks before and after our system redesign in downtown St. Pete. If you look on the map on the left, this is what the network looked like, minus the Sunrunner, since that's more recent to 2022. But everything else was designed that way in about 2016, when we used to serve a common area called Williams Park in the central part of downtown St. Petersburg. However, in coordination with the city, there was a desire for us to vacate the park, and we decided as a solution to still have all the buses served downtown, we created a grid-like network as shown on the map where folks could transfer between different bus routes. And that did work for some riders in certain areas, but there are some bus routes that were very much disconnected. A great example I'll point out real quick is on the southern portion of the map, there's routes like the 7, for example, that don't go much further north than, say, maybe First Avenue South or First Avenue North area. We'll just say about First Avenue South, actually First Avenue South or so. And then several blocks to the north, we have routes like our Route 38 that stop in the northern part of downtown and do not actually connect to those other routes. So for some of our riders, anecdotally, we knew that some of them were having to try to rush to get across downtown from one bus route to another, particularly since many of those routes only operated once an hour. So something that we did in the redesign is, although we knew that the space at Williams Park was not available for our use, we did work closely with our partners at the city of St. Petersburg to identify an area where we could at least route all of the buses through and utilize our existing bus stop infrastructure where riders could wait for the bus and transfer more easily rather than potentially having to walk across downtown. So you can see that we simplified the network, as shown on the map on the right, in order to have more efficient service downtown, improve connections, and improve the first last mile experience for folks trying to get between transit services or to or from transit. And so with that, in our last 2 minutes, Sarah, I'm going to pass it back to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Jacob. It's really, I find it very inspiring to see what unlimited resources PSTA is able to do to make the service so much better. And so if anyone has a question, you can either unmute yourself or put the question in the chat. It looks like we've got 2 minutes left. I had a question while we're waiting for somebody to either pipe up or put a question in the chat. Jacob, so do you have riders say anything about just bike parking at the transit stops or stations, or do most riders that access the bus stops via bike, that they basically just put their bikes on the bus?
Yeah, so we do hear a lot about from riders. So I think the thing that we hear the most is the desire for more bicycle capacity. Right now, we are limited on most of our buses to be able to provide only 2 slots for bikes on the front of the bus. And unfortunately, we're not able to exceed that, but we do get requests all the time from riders to be able to find ways to increase the capacity of bicycles. I think another thing that came to mind with the increased bicycle usage on Sunrunner is that we, at least on that service, have increased the capacity of bicycle usage. So there are 3 bike parking facilities on board where you can roll the front bike into a mechanism that will then lift the entire bicycle. So we have room for 3 of those bikes on board. And since there's a lot of standing room only, people can actually bring their bike and stand with it onto the bus if those 3 are taken up. Unfortunately, that's not something we're able to do on the rest of our fleet. I think the only exception is if it's like the last trip of the night and all of the bike slots are taken, then I think the bus driver is allowed to make an exception. But otherwise, we are limited from a bike capacity perspective, which is what do unfortunately have to provide that answer to riders. And I think that's where trying to identify spots for bike parking in the long term could be ideal if we identify areas where there's more demand than space we can accommodate.
Thanks. Let's just take one question. It looks like we've got one for you, Jacob. She's Allison Moss says, I like the redesign of your network and seems like it would operate much more efficiently. I wonder, however, if you received complaints from those used to the many hyperlocal routes and how you responded.
Yeah, no, that is a great question. And despite all the improvements in the network, it was a cost neutral redesign. So you're definitely not going to be able to make everybody happy in a cost neutral redesign. And I think overall, one of the measures we use to say that we improved access is improve the number of jobs people are able to get to within an hour, particularly on evenings and weekends where our service really ramped down. So I think there were a lot of difficult conversations with folks who were used to the same bus route for decades and decades. And we actually had 1 or 2, to your point, Allison, very specific routes that circulated through communities that we then kind of merged into other routes. So I think the biggest component of addressing that was before system launch, really trying to engage with those riders and to let them know and walk them through what the new alternatives would be. But unfortunately, we're able to address that for some, and then there's just others that are just not going to be able to, maybe fully replicate the trip they had before, or maybe they would have to, take a transfer when they didn't before. So certainly something we address with folks, but I would say some people were happy with the alternative, and some people, there is an alternative, but they were maybe less happy with it.
Thank you so much. So if you have any other questions, you can email me and I can forward those questions. Otherwise, please take this short evaluation. I see that people are interested in the PowerPoint. Yes, it can be shared. It's on the commuterservices.com website. Thank you once again for everybody's participation in this webinar. And I thank you so much to Kyle and to Jacob for sharing their knowledge with us. Have a great day, everybody. Thanks.